detail. That's the business of diplomacy.
So why go now?
The physical location of it is a different matter. Why go now? Because in about 2 weeks' time, we are convening a meeting of all East Asian foreign ministers on the future of what will be an important summit for all of East Asia later in the year. It's the sort of thing I would normally do because of a vast agenda in preparation for a meeting with our colleagues from around the region. At the same time, of course, I will be reviewing progress on the live cattle export question. For me, this is also a deep challenge of foreign policy, as it is of trade policy, as it is of agriculture policy, and for two reasons. No one watching your program wants to see animal welfare standards of the type which was seen on Four Corners recently. At the same time, we are very mindful of the fact that this is a $500 million industry on which so many families right across northern Australia, my own home state of Queensland, are directly affected, and the communities which are supported by the industry. We've therefore got to get this right. That's why we've got 3 senior ministers at work on this, and we are working through it systematically in a set of very difficult challenges.
Of course, another big issue regarding our relations with other countries, the asylum seeker processing deal with Malaysia. You've not visited Malaysia since that deal was initiated. How heavily involved are you in those negotiations?
I pick up a theme in your questions here, Ali. The bottom line is this. The entire negotiation with other regional countries on assessment centres hangs off one core fact, and that is that we, back in March, myself and the Indonesian Foreign Minister presided over a conference in Bali, which for the first time in this region, and the first region in the world, negotiated a regional framework agreement for the processing of asylum seekers within our region. I was into that, again, up to my armpits, for the simple reason is it was chaired by myself, Marty Natalegawa, with dozens of others at ministerial and vice ministerial rank from right across Asia. That's the cornerstone of what now occurs with bilateral negotiations with countries like Malaysia or Papua New Guinea. By the way, at the conference that you just sort of flicked to one side that I saw Marty Natalegawa at, I also had a very good bilateral with the Malaysian Foreign Minister as well.
Indeed you did. There are photographs on your website. But I guess it is a fair question to ask why Malaysia and Indonesia have not been on your travel itinerary, because certainly since that deal with Malaysia, that preliminary deal was announced, you have been to Burma, Kazakhstan, Equatorial Guinea, China, Hungary, Abu Dhabi, Thailand, Finland, Sweden, Norway, the US and the UK. You couldn't fit Indonesia and Malaysia in there for some on-the-ground discussions?
Well, I think what you've done there, Ali, is a little bit unfair, and I think you know that it's unfair. And the reason is I've already been to Indonesia twice in the 9 months that I've been Foreign Minister, and in one of those occasions was to deal with the very issues that we are just speaking about in terms of asylum seekers across the region. As for the Malaysians, I've also been engaging with them in different forums, understanding the fact that the primary negotiation of these arrangements with our Malaysian and Indonesian counterparts on the question of asylum seekers lies with my colleague, the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen. As for the rest of what you've just referred to, let me tell you, foreign ministers around the world are in the habit of travelling for the simple reason that we've all collectively concluded that most foreigners live abroad. Therefore, you've actually got to travel to meet them. And the last thing I'd say to you is, when it comes to travel to Australia, it's a long way from a lot of these countries, and if you're going to engage with them on everything we've got going in the global agenda, current state of the global economy, current state of security in Southeast Asia, current state of our negotiations across the world, you've got to be out there and in it. That's what foreign ministers do, for which I make zero apology.
Well, let's turn to an issue slightly closer to home, and that's the decision on the new contract for Australia's overseas television service, which has been delayed with changes made to the tender after, in particular, the turmoil in the Middle East. Can you just confirm whether reports that the independent committee had made a recommendation that Sky should win that contract over the ABC?
Both the deliberations by what I think you're referring to as the Tender Evaluation Board and its recommendation to the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are matters on which A, I've never been briefed, and B, nor was the Cabinet. Therefore, the decisions that you just referred to in terms of the overall decision-making processes of the government were not mindful of that. They were mindful of the fact that our circumstances over the last 6 months have changed. One of those circumstances is this. Back at the end of last year, when you saw the eruption of the Arab Spring and what unfolded in January, February and March on our television screens in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Jordan, in Bahrain, as well as now, of course, in the civil war in Libya, we found ourselves with a whole range of our interests in this part of the region, part of the world, I should say, seriously challenged. We've got thousands of Australians living in that part of the world. Getting messages out to them through the general media is now very important. We have massive economic interests there. There are tens of thousands of Arab students in Australia. Therefore, this placed a whole new focus on a set of interests on the table which were not there as graphically as before. So it's entirely appropriate for the Cabinet to decide at a strategic level that this should be considered afresh, and by Cabinet as a whole, looking at the totality of our international interests, not just our foreign policy interests.
The one issue that I find a little confusing is that, yes, it's going to be a Cabinet decision, but legally an individual minister has to actually be the final approver. And according to the Minister for Communications, Senator Conroy, he is now the final approval. And yet this entire process, as he explains, is being administered by your department. Why aren't you the final approver?
Well, I'll draw your attention to what Senator Conroy said today in the Senate, and it's a remark with which I completely concur, and that is, the decision maker, in effect, is the Cabinet itself. The approver is consistent with other contractual arrangements entered into by the government in a whole range of different areas, is then assigned to, by legal precedent, almost, to an individual minister to do the approving. That is why one shouldn't read too much into that.
I understand that, but it wasn't you previously, was it not? It is your department that's got carriage of the process.
Well, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has carriage of the process because we have been anchoring the overall tender evaluation process for some considerable period of time. Therefore, why change the underpinning bureaucracy of it? You don't bother about that, that's a waste of time and effort. The key thing, though, is the decision-making process itself by the Cabinet, take into account these new criteria, with the respective tenderers being offered new information to which, quite legitimately, they must now respond. It's an important contract for Australia. It's $223 million worth of public funds. It's to get our image out to the rest of the region and the world beyond, including places like the Middle East, and therefore we've got to get the decision right. And therefore, the inputable Cabinet Ministers is entirely appropriate.
Given how you describe this contract as very important, getting Australia's image out, would it be appropriate to give it to an organisation that will potentially be largely foreign controlled? If I explain that to you in the sense that Sky News is 33% owned by BSkyB, where News Corporation has announced plans to take 100% of that organisation, and 33% owned by the Line network, which belongs to a private equity group.
Well, Ali, you wouldn't be talking out the book of the ABC there.
I would naturally be accused of that, but of course I'm not. I think it's a fair question.
No, well, let me just put it to you in exactly these terms. I am not going to publicly canvass the virtues or vices, the strengths or weaknesses of any of those who are tendering for this particular contract. And the reason being is that those deliberations go through the process which you and I have just been discussing. So for me to go out there and say, one's got these strengths, the other's got the following weaknesses, would be entirely wrong. I don't intend to do that. I haven't in the past, and I don't intend to start now.
And whoever wins the contract, how much control will the government have, and the department have, your department have, over programming?
We'll have a significant input into that, and one of the reasons this contract was put out to tender was to ensure that we would have a maximisation of Australian content in a program or a television network which is paid for by the Australian taxpayer. It's no good running programs around the rest of the world which carry wonderfully interesting BBC documentaries.
But does it mean that if you don't like a story, if you're not happy with a particular rundown, if you're uncomfortable with a particular piece of current affairs, you can say it can't be run?
No, we're not running sort of tacit Izvestia-style censorship arrangements. We're not into that. What we want is the maximisation of Australian content which deals with the reality of modern Australia, not just a bunch of cute fairy marsupials, not just a whole bunch of holes in the ground with lots of iron ore being shipped out on a truck. The world knows that stuff. It's the new face of modern Australia, multicultural Australia. We have a brilliant financial services sector, a brilliant technology sector, a great science sector. We're great at universal primary and secondary education. Our health services are world leading. These are the images of the new Australia we want to be projected in Australia's name to the region and the world, because we're proud of who we are as Australian, and we're not Americans, we're not Brits, we're not Europeans, we're Australians, and therefore we've got to get our message right. So will DFAT have an input into that? You betcha.
So many issues to ask you, so little time. Foreign Minister, many thanks for joining Lateline tonight.
Thanks for having me on the program.